Hi, everybody, and thanks for attending. First off, yes, my name is Mike Anderson. I'm a senior product director at GetWireless, and we're a value-added distributor. I brought up Dave Smith, who's one of my colleagues, to assist with this. 5G mission critical. So the first thing I'm going to talk about is the groups that are driving this, right? So this is our call centers, our public safety answering points, our EMS, our fire services, our law enforcement. These are the ones that are requiring high amounts of data for various different reasons. And they're also requiring specialized data. And what I mean by that is they have not the best ideal conditions. They're out and about everywhere. They're in rough terrain, so they need devices that are ruggedized. They need signal enhancements. They need all this stuff so they can do high-powered data or fast data because of the things that they need. So it's important to know these groups. The other thing that we're going to talk about today, so this is the agenda. What is 5G? So this is going to be Dave's spot. He's going to cover kind of like the what is the 5G story. Then we're going to talk about why is 5G important to public safety, right? What's empowering that? And from there, we're going to go into some of the use cases. I have a couple of use cases that I've done or that I've gotten to work on around 5G, so you can see how some of the stuff is implemented. There's actually a few different combinations of networks that I can talk about. So with that, I'm actually going to turn it over to Dave for a little bit to talk about 5G.
Sure. So how many of you are familiar with 5G? You've heard it, right? Okay. So going back to 4G, that was the first time when all the cellular technologies were brought together and they used a common technology. So AT&T and Verizon did not use different modulation schemes. They used LTE, right? 5G is the next generation of that. Great. What's it supposed to provide? Well, 5G is going to provide a thing called enhanced mobile broadband, which is those super high data rates that you've talked about or heard about, right? Everybody talks about 5G being so much faster. Another thing is on the other end of the spectrum, a thing called machine type communication, which is going to be growing in importance in use with first responders. Machine type communication is communication with things like sensors, right? In a building. That might tell you where people are if you're a first responder or fire person, right? And then in the middle, though, the big thing that you've probably heard a lot about but maybe not been clear is a thing called URLLC, which is ultra reliable low latency communication. The thing about 5G over 4G is it's going to give you greatly improved reliability of a signal, which encompasses a number of different factors, but the point is so that you will have a signal and you will have communication that is reliable and it's not going to be spotty or intermittent or change on you, right? The other part, the low latency communication, is to make the network much more responsive so that you get very little delay as you're transmitting data, which, as you can imagine, in a first responder scenario, is very important. The last thing you need is to someone say duck and have it take 10 seconds before the person will hear it, right? So those factors together are what 5G brings to the table. A couple other things are ubiquitous coverage. The whole thing with 5G now is that coverage will be uniform everywhere, and that coverage will have enormous amount of extra capacity, much beyond 4G LTE. So those are the things that 5G is bringing to the world in general, but they do all apply very much so to first responders. So how is this working for first responders, right? How do first responders use this technology? Well, first of all, they are in the process of trying to figure out a network, right, that's going to be there when they need it. And so the different groups, as they're putting these things together, they use the ubiquitous coverage and the ultra reliability to make sure that when they show up at a scene, it's going to work for them, right? In addition to that, this 5G speed is going to allow enormous amounts of data sharing. So imagine like a really good basketball team, right? Or a really good surgical team. They work together very seamlessly, right? And the better they work together, the better they perform. The higher likelihood of a good outcome from a surgery or maybe win a basketball game. Same thing applies to first responders. So the sharing of data is super important, and 5G is targeted at doing that. In addition to that, the situational awareness that 5G is going to bring is different. So today, in the past, if you were a firefighter and you show up at a building and there's fire, well, you might be able to see the smoke, you might be able to see the fire, right? You don't know who's in the building, where they are, where the fire is throughout the building, what it's doing to the building, right? What's the condition? Can you just run in, or is it about to collapse? You don't know any of that. With 5G and that machine type communication I mentioned earlier, the sensors, when first responders show up to a location, they'll have a great deal of information about that location and what is going on, where the people are, right? Where the damage is, what's going on throughout the building. Is there power, for example, right? These things are very important to first responders and will enable them to focus and get their job done quicker. So there's a bunch of different devices, and we threw some of these up here, and you probably all go, yeah, that makes sense. Basically, computing devices of various kinds, right? And communication devices of various kinds. Radios, laptop computers, those kinds of things. Cameras, right. But what's going on beyond that is think at the network level. Think at the dispatchers area. They're getting data streams, high volume data streams that are coming into these, call them data centers, right? The 911 centers. They need sophisticated routers and other communications equipment to integrate these streams and then broadcast them back out to whoever needs them. You don't normally think about that, right? But that radio that's talking between, guys talking to his chief, also might need, someone else might need it. And it needs to be routed usually over a network to do that. So that's the one side of devices that aren't listed here that you might not think about. And the other side are those sensors that I mentioned, right? You've all heard smart building. Okay, so smart building often does presence detectors for people, right? What does the air seem like? Is there oxygen or carbon dioxide, right? You have smoke detectors, you have all these things. Well, if you apply those in a first responder context, they can really be used, can't they? If there's a fire in a building and you know where the people are, you can go get them out first, right? Or if you know where the fire is, you can just go right to the fire and maybe save people from, as they often do, get hurt just leaving the building, right? So this information, and I hate to say it, but like an active shooter situation, you want to know where the people are. And so these sorts of sensors, smart building sort of thing, as applied to first responders, are right now growing in importance. So we're going to mention a couple of things: market drivers and market inhibitors. Okay, so the market drivers, the things that are making first responder technology grow at such a rapid pace, are pretty straightforward, right? It's this need for all this data. And it comes in all these different forms. You have video, you have radio audio, you have digital audio, and you've got sensors, and you have all sorts of things. And so the amount for the need of high-speed data is just growing rapidly, right? There are some really strong correspondences with 5G network topology and first responder network needs. And to a great extent, that was taken into account by 3GPP when they designed all this stuff. They did have emergency responder needs in mind, but it also is just the right technology for it. So say things like Wi-Fi, others, they're just not going to work as well. So the good thing about that is we've got a network that's going to work. The flexibility of 5G, one of the things I didn't mention early on about what's so great about 5G is you can deploy it in many different ways. Okay? One of the big things about 5G today is that you can have public networks, you can have private networks, you can have enterprise networks, right? And you can set networks up very quickly. So one of the things that you could see happening is first responders coming with their own 5G network. So let's say there was a hurricane, right? And a lot of cell towers get damaged. Well, you have mobile towers that you can bring into an area, set that up, and the first responders can all communicate as if the public network was still there, right? So these are some of the drivers, this flexibility and things like that. Another thing is privacy, right? 5G, with its edge computing capability that it tends to push and support, provides a great deal of privacy. And so on the law enforcement side, instead of looking and filming everybody who drives through an intersection, and by the way, you're going to catch everybody that walks through the intersection or rides a bicycle through the intersection, you use multi-level inference in machine learning, and you only just say this license plate went through the intersection. That preserves people's privacy going forward, right? Which is kind of a big deal.
All right, some of the barriers.
Oh, yeah. Well, I hate to talk about negative stuff, right? But one of the things 5G is hungry for, like my kids used to have hungry, hungry hippo, right? And it's hungry for spectrum. And so to get all these services, to get all these speeds, to get all these great latency and all that kind of stuff, you need a lot of spectrum. And for first responders, you generally want to have dedicated spectrum, right? You don't want to have other people coming in and watching videos or playing games and getting in the way of, something really important like fighting a fire. So dedicated spectrum is short. Today we have band 14, part of FirstNet. That's great. Band 14 in and of itself is not quite adequate for all the new kinds of things that are coming out. So some of the new spectrum that's been allocated through C-band, right? Perhaps CBRS, which is shared spectrum. There's opportunities to find spectrum, but it needs to be found. In addition to that, some of the technologies are still kind of new. And I don't know how many of you have been technology developers, but you know that path. Technology, it starts out and it works, but it works not everywhere, not all the time, right? And as it matures, then it gets better, and it works everywhere, and it works all the time. So some of these technologies, 5G, believe it or not, is still fairly new. And so some of these technologies don't work everywhere all the time. So there are some technology improvements that have to occur, especially in areas called millimeter wave, if you've heard that term before. Other than that, I'm not going to go through all of these negatives because I'm generally not a negative person. But there are some market barriers that are being worked through. And you say, okay, when? Right? Well, there was a recent release of 3GPPs called Release 17, came out last summer. It's going to address a lot of these issues. So, for example, there's a new kind of hardware that was defined called a repeater. I think you all probably know what a repeater is, right? In one ear, out the other. I get that said to me all the time. And they have smart repeaters. And so imagine being able to bring the signal with you, right? With a repeater. There's also a really cool feature. It's called side link. And what it does is it allows my phone to talk to your phone to get to the network. And that means that if a group of first responders go in a building, even if they lose contact with the network, their phones can talk to each other. Now, isn't that cool, right? And talk to each other using cellular, so that means data and audio, right? That's a new technology that was released with Release 17. It's going to be improved in Release 18. It's going to be, more and more improved over time. But that's something that isn't quite out there yet, but will be. So that's it for me.
Awesome. Thanks, Dave. So next, I'd kind of like to talk about some of the devices that are being utilized in first responders. So I'm actually going to work backwards on this list. I'm going to start with the ultra-rugged mobility industrial routers. These are the ones that are actually out on the edge. These are the ones that our first responders are using our EMS. This is in an ambulance. The thing about these is they need to be ruggedized. They need to also survive high temperatures. So if you live up in Minneapolis, Minnesota, like me, you need to withstand the extreme cold. Or if you live down here, you need to handle the extreme heat. Right. So these routers are all sorts of different kinds. They're vibration proof, shock proof. You can drop them. They're really ruggedized. The other thing about them is there's multiple types of them. So there's routers with multiple WAN connections, and there's routers with multiple cellular radios. One of the products that I work with can hold up to 18 cellular radios in it in one box, and it can manage a lot of different carriers. You can bond multiple carriers in one connection to provide that fast throughput. And then to Dave's point earlier, when we talked about the data centers or the devices that are managing the data, that's where we get our enterprise and mobility routers. These are more of fixed applications, and especially in an SD-WAN solution, this is where you can have your mobility routers connect to your enterprise routers, and you can do all sorts of neat solutions like persistent failover or bonding or smoothing if you're doing a video application. Next, you have programmable routers, and this is kind of touching to Dave's point too about like private networking. This is where you can have applications run on the routers or on the modems themselves to help speed up that process. Dave talked about almost real-time connectivity, and that's what some of these programmable routers will do. And then if you have the need to build your own box, so if you think of like autonomous robots or drones or whatever you want to build or connect to the network, that's where you can use the embedded modems and the modules to help out with that. So these are, again, some of the devices that I'm seeing because I work at a distribution company. These are some of the things that we are working on day to day with our first responders. To help out with these devices on the signal side, there's all sorts of different things. You have antennas that can do that. So you have, there's so many different antennas out there. You can get directional antennas, you can get omnidirectional antennas, you can get specific antennas so they can fit the rivets of the roof of a Ford Explorer and a police cruiser. You can have marine antennas that are really high gain, that are about 3 to 4 feet high, that provide the best signal. And then moving down the chart, you can actually embed the modem or the router and the antenna into one box. So you really help out with the signal strength. There's very little signal loss in that cable if it's in there. And then the two middle ones are also special because they work on FirstNet. They actually increase the power of band 14, so you can provide a better signal or a stronger signal when you're further out. So it helps with the signal coverage.
Now, how many of you have heard of HPUE, high power user equipment? I haven't. My son is a special agent for the Treasury, and we gave him one of those. And they used it to be able to monitor illegal transactions in things like deep levels of a parking structure, where they were never able to do that. Because criminals are pretty smart, right? They go to places where they think they can't be monitored. And HPUE is one of those things that kind of levels that playing field a little bit.
Mm-hmm. Perfect. And then the other thing we have is our smart coverage solutions. So this is if you want to provide an increased signal to a specific area, you can do that. We have a couple of different product lines at our distribution company that can do that. Okay. So now the next thing I talk about is some of the use cases that we have. So the first one is a large city. And this trial that went on for a whole year, actually it's not a trial, it's implemented. This actually process went on for a year because they had a big event that happens in February, beginning of February. And by the way, congratulations to Kansas City Chiefs. But what they needed to do is stream video over the city. So they had video devices up all over the city on buildings, light poles, wherever, so they can monitor all the traffic that's coming into the city. So they used a different combination of devices. Dave talked about millimeter wave. There's a router out there that has millimeter wave technology into it. They plug that into another box that has cellular, and that also manages an SD-WAN solution for failover and for bonding. And then that talked to a data center. So it used millimeter wave. It also used another 5G frequency called sub-6. So those two combinations, they were able to keep up the video transmission so they could monitor it. And it wasn't just for a certain day. This was for a couple of weeks at a time because people kept coming in constantly. So they needed to be able to respond to that. And if there was a need for a first responder, they can send people out quickly for that.
And let me add to that. There was another use of this same digital data. Imagine you're dispatching fire trucks, for example. You need to know where the traffic is, right? They have the light control. But at a 2 or 3 alarm fire where you have multiple vehicles coming, you don't want all the vehicles to take the same road, right? Or take crossing roads and fight for the light. So these things are coupled to an artificial intelligence backend that knows where all the trucks are coming from and gives them a route and controls the lights based upon all sorts of factors, traffic, road work, all sorts of stuff, weather even, and gets them there pre-positioned around the building, so they don't have to spend time moving trucks to get them out of each other's way. So video like this has enormous numbers of benefits.
Mm-hmm. All right, the next one is a 911 center, or a PSAP, otherwise known as a public safety answering point. So this county had multiple PSPs, basically, and they had a couple of different use cases. And here, if the primary internet goes out, so this is a failover solution. If the primary internet goes out, it needs to fall over to another one seamlessly. And PSAPs, what they like to do is they like to have 3 or 4 backups just in case of the emergency. The fact that they're looking for a 3rd or a 4th backup means that the first 2 have actually gone out at some point. So this county actually came out with a couple of different solutions. So for the smaller locations, they had just a single 5G radio. But then this talked to a data center so they could manage that failover solution. And then they also had a device with multiple 5G radios in it, and they could have dual carriers in there, right? So now if you think you can put FirstNet in there, and then you could put Verizon in another one, so then you could have a 3rd and a 4th backup, but only have one box. So you don't have to have multiple pieces of equipment at the place. The other stipulation that they had with this is the routers needed to have multiple WAN sources, so you could bring in the primary internet, the secondary internet, and then use cellular, either 3rd or 4th, as a backup. So this was a solution that we rolled out, I think, at the beginning of 2002. But again, so far, they don't need a 5th or a 6th, so that's good.
2002 or 22?
Sorry, 2022. Thank you for that correction. Okay, and then the last one is an EMS connectivity solution. The use case here is really the response time, increasing that response time that Dave talked about earlier. And this is a video solution, so it's kind of a simple setup. There is a 5G router in the back of the ambulance. On top is an antenna, an outdoor antenna, and that antenna also produces a Wi-Fi signal. It creates a bubble inside the vehicle, and it creates a bubble outside the vehicle. And then connected to the router outside of all the other things that are in the ambulance, but the primary thing is a tablet. And they can stream video back to the hospital. So really around strokes. Stroke victims, you have 60 seconds, that's called the golden hour, to respond to somebody that had stroke symptoms. So if you can get to somebody within 60 minutes, sorry, I almost said that one wrong too, 60 seconds, 60 minutes, there's the survivability rate is greatly increased. So what they're doing is, when the EMS people get out to a location and they identify a stroke, they'll video conference back to the doctor and they'll start care right there. And they'll keep care going till they get to the hospital. So when they get to the hospital, the doctor doesn't have to reassess or start treatment again. Start treatment from that point. They actually save all that drive time and the response time from the EMS. So this has really increased the care and the survivability from certain victims. All right. So we talked a little bit how they're using it. We talked about a bunch of why they're using it. So let's talk about what's going to happen in the future. Who's going to invest in this?
Oh, and you look to me to do that.
Yes, I am.
Oh, okay. Well, so first responders in general, right? That whole market, if you're viewing it from someone who's selling into that market is growing. And it's growing at a nice clip. People argue over numbers, things like that. But it's definitely growing, and it's expected to grow because of all those things we mentioned earlier. Not only the new technologies coming out, but the new parts of the technologies, like the smart building side, and then on the network side, the dispatch side. All of them are needing this technology. And by the end of 2023, there's a talk later that talks about delivering on the promise of 5G. And 2023 is a huge year for 5G. The crux is that with the mid-band rollouts that carriers are doing right now, they're going to be greatly increasing your perceived service levels in 5G, which means that first responders will be able to take advantage of that. So first responders who really need 5G, since 5G services will be increasing and improving so much this year, should see a great improvement by the end of the year. And that's really good for all of us if we ever need to make that call, right? So that's it for me.
Awesome. Thank you, guys.